Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Legally Speaking. I'm your host, Oves Anwer. We are in week 3 of the US-Israeli attacks on Iran, and with no real end in sight. Both countries seem to be ramping up their rhetoric and certainly the attacks as well. What we've seen so far are a range of strange justifications, legal justifications, political justifications being given by the US administration for why it launched its attacks. Some of these range from regime change, which we initially heard. Those were then toned down, and we started hearing about eliminating Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles or eliminating Iran's ability to fire missiles, ballistic missiles at its neighbors, in particular Israel. We've also heard that this is an attempt to free the Iranian women from the grip of the radical leadership. Now, the goals keep on changing, and we're not 100% sure what really is the US aim now. What has become abundantly clear is that the US administration wasn't perhaps expecting the type of response that Iran has given them. Certainly, Iran is being hit hard. It's lost its supreme leader. It's lost much of its capability in terms of firing missiles and drones at Israel or any of the targets in the region. And major military capability has been degraded. And yet, after 16 days of some of the most severe bombings and severe missile attacks since the Second World War, perhaps, it is still standing and fighting. And to discuss this, to better understand really the legality of the initial attack, Iran's self-defense, the targeting of, say, Gulf countries, US bases in Gulf countries, and some of the maritime interests in the region, I have with me Ayesha Malik. Ayesha Malik is an expert as well as the head of the War Law Institute. Ayesha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Actually, I wanted to begin by discussing there are a number of questions on the legality of the U.S. strikes, and it seems patently unlawful what took place. But there is precedence of anticipatory self-defense. In fact, the Caroline incident was really one example of this. Where do you think is there any justification based on that Iran had thrown missiles or fired missiles at Israel before? There has been this level of belligerence there. Do you think that there's any justification for these preemptive strikes that the US and Israel did?
So I think even under the doctrine of anticipatory self-defense, these strikes were manifestly unlawful. And so what we see is this idea that you have to have imminence, and that is under the Caroline test, right? So even if we accept that there is this narrowly construed right to preemptive self-defense against an imminent armed attack, we also know that Iran was not about to wage an imminent armed attack at all. And for that criteria, it would have to be that Iran had the intention to attack, that it had the capability to attack, and that this was the last window of opportunity to prevent it from conducting that armed attack. None of those criteria are met in this situation. And even when it comes to the Caroline test, we know that the Caroline test construes imminence very, very narrowly, right? So it said the right to self-defense would have to be instant, overwhelming, leaving, no window of opportunity, no choice of means, no moment for deliberation. And none of those situations were actually met in this case. And we've had some really, really strange sentences coming out of the Trump administration, including the fact that we've been facing an imminent threat from Iran for 47 years. There is no concept of imminence, which is, temporally narrowly construed, which would include that imminent armed attack coming at you for a period of 47 years. It's stretching that word so far beyond what anyone could construe it as that it's impossible for this to be argued to be necessary and proportionate right to self-defense.
Absolutely. And I wanted to also, touch upon both the legal aspects, but also some of the politics that are coming out. I don't know if you remember, but when the Second Gulf War was happening, though, they had this Iraqi spokesperson for the Iraqi military, and he would just be saying, "Oh, we're winning everything," even though the Iraqi forces were being decimated. And Pete Hegseth's press conferences, his briefings, his daily briefings seem very much like that, right? Where he's coming in and there's a lot of bluster and there's a lot of machismo involved, and he's trying to be this really tough guy on it, right? But it's coming out as if he's trying a little too hard. What do you make of really these statements that are coming out there? And some of these are patently war crimes that he's talking about. Like, for example, giving no quarter, right? That was
Yeah.
something he mentioned recently. What do you make of these?
So I really think that he has the vocabulary range of like a frat boy. I think that he is the worst picture of the military brass in America,
Mm,
which I don't think that they actually are. So when you hear General Kane's press statements, they're so vastly different from that of Pete Hegseth. He just sounds like someone who's really, really drunk on his own Kool-Aid, in that he's drunk on the military might that he thinks that the US purports to have, while the Pentagon itself is actually much more measured. And I
mm,
think that we're seeing some very confusing statements now coming out. So the leak that came out was that the Pentagon had not adequately prepared Trump for the eventuality that the Strait of Hormuz would be closed. And then you saw another leak coming out saying, no, we definitely did, but it was that people in the administration downplayed the fact that they would actually close the strait and we would be in this economic stranglehold situation to Iran that the world economy is currently in. And so we're really seeing all of those kind of crafts within the administration coming out to the fore. And I really, really think that the Pentagon officials from the leaks before the war and the leaks currently that we're seeing, they really warned Trump not to do this. And yet you had Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, Pete Hegseth, all of the Tweedledums and Tweedledees within the administration, and they had the ear of Trump, unfortunately. And that led him into the quagmire that we're seeing today.
absolutely. I mean, it just seems a bit of a comedy. What's going on. Like, it's very difficult to believe that these decisions are taking place by these individuals. Unfortunately, Aisha, in your article, you very had a great segment on Iran's ability to now use self-defense, having been aggrieved and having been attacked. Could you explain that a little bit, like what legality there is to Iran, is fighting back, the targets it's choosing? Some of these become quite serious issues at times.
Yeah, this has been quite contested lately as well. So what is very, very clear is that Iran has the right to self-defense against Israel. That is not in question. And it also has the right to self-defense against the US. Now, the fact that it doesn't have the capability to enforce that right to self-defense against the US doesn't mean that it still does not have that right. So now the issue is that that Iran is taking out U.S. military bases as well as other civilian sites, which we will also talk about, which wouldn't come under the law of armed conflict, but just squarely in the jus ad bellum right now, the right to self-defense in and of itself of Iran. Does it have that right against U.S. military bases in the Gulf states? So in UAE, Saudi, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, all of the ones that Iran has gone against. And the question really would come down to whether that territory was used by the US in its strikes against Iran. And so Iran would only have the right to self-defense if we had, similarly to how Russian troops used Belarus as a
Mm,
way to attack Ukraine, Ukraine would then have the right to use force and self-defense against Belarusian territory, because under Article 3F of the definition of aggression, allowing one's territory to be used amounts to an act of aggression that you have committed against that state itself. Now,
okay.
we know for a fact now that at least Kuwait and Bahrain are being used to launch strikes from. And so now that has been proven. We have testimony, and it seems like CENTCOM kind of released that testimony on purpose. We have the images now that Bahraini territory and Kuwaiti territory is being used to launch strikes against Iran. The other
Mhm.
Gulf states have really said that we've been dragged into this war. We were not being used. We told you that our territory would not be used. Iran would have to show evidence that that was not the case. And I mean, it has some limited evidence already in the fact that there were transponders going over Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states in order to inflict those strikes. But it would have to prove that that was happening on the 28th of February. And that's why it has the right to self-defense against the Gulf states too.
I think that's very interesting. What what is also, I mean, so just to clarify here, if there's a US base on, say, in the UAE, right, and it has, it's been used for attacks against Iran, it becomes a lawful target. But does UAE become part of this? Does UAE, for example, Emirati forces, would they be targetable under this doctrine?
So then the law of armed conflict would come into play. But purely under the jus ad bellum, it would be whether you're coming within the definition of aggression under Article 3F. So in the same way that Belarusian territory was being used for Russian armed forces to invade Ukraine, in the same way, if their territory has been used under the jus ad bellum for the strikes against Iran, Iran would have that right to self-defense against them. And then become under the law of armed conflict. So whether it's a lawful target or not, military bases are always lawful targets. Yeah, but there would definitely be an international armed conflict between Iran and the Gulf states then.
Okay, so that changes the game quite a bit.
Yeah.
And what about U.S. bases that haven't been used um, in an attack? Don't they carry the military potential that they could be used at a later stage, or that they could be used to help, the planning or the targeting or decisions that are done there because they're in the theater roughly in that area?
They could be used, and the state which has conducted the armed attack against the state claiming the right to self-defense, they could be used against that state. Until they are used for that initial strike, you do not have the right to self-defense against them, because otherwise that would make every US base in every which country targetable. And also you can't violate the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of that state itself. You would need a reason. That reason can only come from Article 3F of the definition of aggression.
That's fascinating. But one of the issues that we're seeing here is that I was reading a tweet where there was an Israeli saying that, oh look, Iran's using cluster munitions against us. That's against international law. And everyone under that was saying, you're quoting international law now,
Yeah.
right after 2 years of violating this, committing the most heinous forms of war crimes and crimes against and genocide, really. Israel quoting this. Is there any justification for if there's a state has violated international law like this? Is there any response that you can do by also violating international law? Can we just do away with international law like that?
No, and there's no way of doing away with international law,
Mhm.
regardless of how much the other state has violated international law. You are still bound by international law. That is one of the key tenets of international law. What is really interesting in the case of cluster munitions, and we're seeing Israel also use white phosphorus. Both of those issues remain that they are indiscriminate under the laws of war, and so if you are targeting them solely against a military target, that's fine. If you're using them against civilian population, which we are seeing Iran doing, and which we are seeing Lebanon doing, and Israel doing in Lebanon with its use of white phosphorus, both of those become unlawful under the laws of war. What is interesting, though, is the attacks on the oil refineries and oil storage. So this comes under the US's and Israel's very, very wide definition of military targets. So they include war-sustaining objectives as military targets. The US does
Mhm.
this, Israel does this. No other state really does this, includes that under their definition. And so the argument used against the US is that if you have such a wide definition, surely that means that Silicon Valley can be taken out lawfully because it could then be sustaining the Pentagon, the Ponzi scheme of AI that we're seeing in the US. And so Iran has really kind of used this, the US used this in terms of oil fields in Syria. It also used this in the sense of cash stockpiles and drug fields in Afghanistan.
Oh, wow.
And so
Okay.
now the argument would be, it would, under that definition of war sustaining as being a military objective, would Iran's attacks on oil production facilities in the Gulf be a lawful military target? The argument then falls down on the sense that it would have to be sustaining the war. It doesn't seem like those facilities are sustaining the war, and it doesn't seem like Iran's oil facilities are sustaining that war either.
Mhm. Yeah, and you mentioned AI here. We've I think already from Iran, we're hearing that there are certain US companies that have been targeted, or that they've at least listed them that these could be lawful targets. We certainly have seen recent leaks and whatnot of Palantir and OpenAI and Claude and all of these Anthropic, all of these entities being used in
Yeah.
cyber strikes and the artificial intelligence used in there. Would that make those particular companies, I don't know, targets in your view?
It's a really, really interesting question, and we've seen the attacks on the Amazon AWS storage centers where they hold the cloud, where they hold all
Data
of that
centers.
information.
Yeah.
And now that's causing significant nuisance or irritation to civilian populations. You can't get your food panda delivery on time. They can't really find you properly, that type of thing. They miss your addresses. Nuisance or irritation to civilian population would never come under the definition of it being a disproportionate harm. But the question is, to what extent are those carrying are those data centers a military objective, in the sense that they're being used by the military to conduct attacks? Because in that case, they would be targetable. And then the issue is about proportionality. Again, nuisance, irritation to civilians would not be a factor taken into account in determining whether it's a disproportionate strike. But that is a very, very interesting question coming out of this conflict, particularly because I don't think we've seen in a conflict before, perhaps to some extent in Russia, Ukraine, where a country has said we are going after those data centers in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another issue that arises, and certainly will be an issue in the future, I think, is distinction when it comes to data centers. Because these data centers have civilian data on them as well as, and could be used for military data as well. And if they're AI, then the processing back end really is done by a lot of these things, and the processing might that they have there. So would there be an obligation to distinguish, if you're using such data centers, to distinguish between military data centers and then civilian data centers? Do you think this could arise?
Yes. Yeah, I think that it could be. I think also the threshold for when something becomes a military objective is quite low. And so in the sense of the minute it becomes dual use, it is targetable. And then what is being taken into account in terms of the proportionality calculation. But also, I think now perhaps there will be a duty to disclose where you're holding and storing military data and where you're holding and storing civilian data, to be like, this is not targetable, this is actually targetable. And the extent to which so much of that is now intertwined. And it's going to be quite difficult to distinguish between the two.
Absolutely, and I think what we're seeing, especially from Palantir and a lot of other organizations, is civilian data has become military data, where they're using, so many data points that they have and utilizing that, and training their models or better understanding, and taking targeting decisions based on the information that is publicly available across the board. So there's certainly going to be that element.
And
I,
just to add to
yeah,
that, is
please.
that Iran has really learnt from the June 2025 conflict that it was relying then on GPS.
Mhm.
And it was realizing that it was getting jammed. It was realizing that there were a lot of issues with relying on the military factor of GPS, that it was using the military stream. And since then, what we've seen is so much more accurate Iranian targeting intelligence that they now suspect has been supplied by the Russians or the Chinese. And a lot of that has come from Iran deciding after June 2025 to get off the GPS system and to now go on the Chinese Beidou system.
Yeah,
And we're seeing how much, the West likes to say that Russia and China are feckless allies. They're not the kind of allies that you want in your pocket, even though, we all saw Zelensky getting wedgied in the White House. But we know from a Pakistani perspective how valuable China is as an ally, and most of that is coming actually from data sets. It's not coming from hardware. It's not coming from actual military weapons and missiles. It's coming in the form of data, and the Iranians have been using that data very, very effectively.
absolutely. Um, this brings me to another question, and specifically on this. Um, what is the level of involvement of China and Russia, and could they at some point become targetable as well? I mean, uh, would it be justified to launch attacks, say, on them because of, say, their assistance to that? And it's very interesting because we've seen for the past several years now the U.S. providing active support to Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
And now the exact same is happening in this particular context, in a much lesser degree, in fact. We're seeing Russian, it's not openly providing arms in the same way that the US has been doing to Ukraine. But is this a taste of their own medicine? And does that, how, liable does that make China or Russia in that sense?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because the US, in terms of its provision of supplies, weapons, and a lot of intelligence to the Ukrainians, argued that it could do so on the basis of its qualified neutrality, on the basis that Ukraine has been the victim of aggression. And because it's the victim of aggression and is fighting a lawful war of self-defense, it could be so supplied, and it wouldn't violate the law of neutrality. Otherwise, states can always, in peacetime, states can always provide each other with weapons. That has never been an issue. The key issue remains the provision of weapons to non-state actors. So under those same terms, if we apply them here, Iran is waging a lawful war of self-defense. It has been the victim of an act of aggression, and it can call on China and Russia to help it, and it can even call on them in the right of collective self-defense. But of course, that would mean that they are co-belligerents in an armed conflict. And I think that the level of support that they have currently provided would keep them below that level of co-belligerency.
I see. No, I think that probably makes the most sense here. And looking at the arguments that the US has already made with regards to, say, Ukraine and support there, I think, it certainly shielded them. There was also another rather unfortunate incident that took place about a week back, which was the sinking of the Iranian naval vessel, the Dina, which was, it was in the international, fleet review that was taking place in India, and it was visiting there. So on its way back, it was torpedoed by a US submarine. Now, this was outside the active theater of war. What do you make of that? Is that a lawful kill? Because it is a military vessel after all.
Yeah. Yeah, so we had a brief conversation about this at the time. And since then, we've had Michael Schmidt come out with an article about this in Just Security, where he argues actually that the IRIS Dina is a warship, which means that under the laws of naval warfare, it is a lawful military target. It can be targeted. And it can be targeted so long anywhere, actually, which was a surprise to me. It can be targeted anywhere so long as it's not in neutral waters. And because the targeting happened in international waters, it could then be targeted over there. One of the key ways in which this is an issue, though, is that under the Geneva Conventions, you have an obligation to rescue shipwrecked sailors. And that obligation to look for and to rescue any shipwrecked sailors was not complied with. The US torpedoed it, and you saw Pete Hegseth, war criminal Pete Hegseth, go out and say they died a quiet death. They're not meant to die a quiet death. Under the Geneva Conventions, there is an obligation to go and hunt and look and rescue shipwrecked sailors. Which
Maximum
Sri Lanka,
lethality, that's what it is.
yes.
So
These pesky rules of engagement, we don't need
exactly.
those.
These stupid and politically correct rules of engagement. That's what he calls them. Having said that, I mean, haven't there been, when it comes to submarine warfare, don't the rules, slightly modify? We saw this, from World War II, right, where German U-boats would initially, torpedo something and then go rescue the people there, right? And then after that, even though they put their transponders on, they were targeted once or twice by, I think it was Allied bombers or anti-submarine aircraft, and so the Germans started changing that and saying that once you torpedo, if you're a submarine, you torpedo, you don't then go in for surviving. So is there some leeway there? Or is the obligation absolute under the Geneva Convention?
I'm not sure. In terms of, would there be a military necessity kind of carve out that even though these were shipwrecked during the course of hostilities?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Okay. It is a difficult question. I mean, the more research that I've done, there is no explicit carve out that I've been able to find.
Right.
But if this is an element of tactics and when it comes to submarine warfare, perhaps, because we do know that the rules change somewhat because of the nature of submarine warfare as well.
Okay.
Aisha, I wanted to ask you about the use of drones. It's been a game changer. Last few years, I think the earliest actual battlefield use that I saw in large scale was Azerbaijan and Armenia, right, where Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan really used drones in a very effective manner. Anything that was a static target was taken out, so tanks and all that. We're also seeing Iran using their Shahid drones, which have become an iconic brand almost in drones across the world, and even the US the Americans are reverse engineering these and coming up with their own Lucas suicide drones. They've been used primarily as saturation, to saturate the these interceptor missiles that the Americans have and their air defense that the Israelis have. But they're also targeting a lot of civilian targets that we've seen, or at least they appear to be civilian targets, whether it's the UAE or Dubai and or Qatar or elsewhere. What is the justification of using these, in warfare like this?
So I think that yeah, as you mentioned, we've seen drone use for a long time now, and I think the very useful aspect of these drones, these suicide drones, and that they're not expected to come back to Iran, is that they're incredibly cheap to make, and Iran seems to be able to make these very quickly and very, very cheaply. I think that the latest cost that came out was that they were $7,000,
Wow.
and
We
someone
could buy
joked that
some.
they
Maybe
exactly,
if
yeah. Someone joked that they're actually the cost of what influencers are getting paid to make pro-Israel posts is like the same amount that Iran is actually making these suicide drones.
so it's
And
no
they've
pun intended,
used
but bang for your buck, right? No,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
sorry.
And they're incredibly, incredibly efficient. So in terms of you have it's very, very difficult to navigate. It's actually very, very difficult to shoot down these
Mhm.
the Shahid drones because they actually go fly at quite a low altitude. And if they're flying over a civilian population, it just is difficult for them to be intercepted in the same way. And so the fact that they have taken out much of the radars in the Gulf, so this is $7,000 Iranian drone taking out a $1 billion radar system. And I'm pretty sure that the Arabs would be feeling like they've been sold snake oil at this point
Absolutely.
because they
Bamboozled.
invested so heavily in all of these defense systems. And now they're getting shot to pieces by the cheapest technology that Iran could muster under decades of sanctions. And they're being left, empty-handed because the Americans are now saying that actually whatever protection we have, we're going to give it to the Gulf. And it's also a very, very terrible message to American allies in the sense that the scrambling you have seen from the Trump administration, and on day 4 of the war, they went to get the THAAD missile interceptors from South Korea, which they had put in
Yeah.
South Korea to the chagrin of the Chinese and to much hoo-ha at the time. And they're like, can we have that back? We kind of need it for this war that we were completely, completely ill prepared for. But in terms of the sites that are being taken out, the military objectives, going after the radars, going after the US bases, going after any of the military targets, including the fighter jets there, have proved are completely lawful military objectives. So long as they take into account their proportionality calculation, I don't think that there seem to be, on the face of it, many proportionality issues there. When
Mhm.
it comes to taking out civilian targets, it seems to be that Iran has said we're going after US military personnel in apartment buildings. We're going after them in hotels that we know that they're staying in. Again, the question of where they're getting that intelligence from, I think, was quite shocking for the Americans, maybe provided by the Russian and the Chinese, which indicates, their level of infiltration too. But the argument there would be that the apartment block itself is a civilian object. The people around in that apartment block are also civilians, and therefore they need to be taken into account in a proportionality calculation. Combatants from the other side can be targeted. And again, the question of going after, if you're in an international armed conflict, going after uh, the Kuwaiti armed forces, going after the Bahraini armed forces, going after the US armed forces, I think there we wouldn't have the question of it being an indiscriminate attack. The question would be the civilian objects around you, particularly if you are in an apartment building, in a residential hotel, and the people around you.
Absolutely. Um, Actually, this is really interesting because if we take the Israeli definition when it comes to, say, targeting buildings, right, it's a lot more expensive than anyone else, even the Americans, right? And we've seen this. They've targeted buildings where there would be a single sniper, perhaps, and the entire building would be considered lawful and
Yeah.
justified in being destroyed. So if we take the same argument there, right, it becomes a lot of these buildings do become then, and according to their things there. But do you think that these types of definitions that we have and that states put in, does that stand, um, the test of, say, international critique or the rest of the international community? How do we really just, gauge whether an interpretation is correct or not, in your opinion?
So I think whenever we have these conversations about, the death of international law has been much recorded and greatly exaggerated over a period of time. I definitely think that the jus ad bellum is a new law. So when we keep on seeing that violated and the amount of times it's been violated since 2022, and even longer if we look back since the Second World War, the jus ad bellum, in the sense of the violation on the use of force going to war against other states, is very new compared to the law of armed conflict, which is the protection of civilians, the protection of civilian objects, the protection of the environment, and not inflicting disproportionate damage on civilians when you're targeting a military objective. Those are very, very ancient roots. They go back to the Bible. We have them in the Quran. We have them in the Law of the Vedas. We have them in Sun Tzu. And they were really, at their crux at the time, they weren't about morality. They weren't about humanitarianism. They were about military strategy. So they were saying at the time, this is not going to help you in waging a war, is to go against the civilian population. So these are the rules for how you keep prisoners. These are the rules for how you keep messengers. Arguably, the oldest rules are about those who are negotiating peace treaties, which makes what Israel did against Hamas in Qatar last year even more heinous. These are very, very ancient roots of the laws of war. And so I think that even if we were going to set fire to the building of international law and try and create it all over again, I think that those rules would stay the same. And so in terms of, do they have legitimacy? I say yes, they have legitimacy because they stretch back so far. We have, evidence of treaties about the protection of prisoners of war dating back to 1400 BC. We're going to come back to the same rules every time that we try and recreate this. So why not, keep the rules as they are? We don't need to overly fetishize them. I think that the law of proportionality in particular is one that needs a lot of work. I think that it can be inherently way too subjective, as we have seen. Even when it comes to the Manab bombing, of the school, we know that actually the issue there comes down to the fact that precautions weren't taken, right?
Mm.
So the US military commanders who were signing off on that attack, if journalists accessing open source accounts after the fact can be like, hey, there's a girls' school there, you should have verified that target,
Yeah.
right? So even though it was a mistake, you would never be held liable for a war crime for it in front of the International Criminal Court. You failed to abide by the principle of precaution. And I think that really set the tone for this conflict. And I think even when it comes to centers in the US where soldiers of conscience decide that they don't want to fight, they pointed to that moment and they said,
Mm.
when you bombed the girls' school, that's when I knew I couldn't be involved in whatever this is. And so I think those are based inherently on the inherent morality and humanity that we find in the laws of war.
No, absolutely. Actually, I think we've discussed enough of international law. Let's discuss a bit of the politics behind this. Um, what have you been able to get, from the statements that have come and then changed and then come again, um, from Trump and Hegseth and the rest of the Trump administration on what their goals are? Because it's always been unclear from day one whether it was to take out the uranium, whether it was to take out their abilities, their ability to shoot missiles at Israel or other countries, whether it was regime change. What do you think really is, the idea that the Trump administration has behind this?
So in terms of messaging, I think that the US won the war on day 3, and then it won it again on day 7. And I think it just won it again a few days ago, according
Yeah.
to what Trump is saying. So they won numerous times, yet they're still in a non-conflict, which is a bit unclear. But in terms of, I think that now we have very, very divergent aims from the US compared to what Israel is saying. So I think that Trump would have been very happy with the one and done strike, exactly the way they took out Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. Come in, take out the Ayatollah, then you're done. You can be like, whatever you guys do, pick up a Delcy Rodriguez from the ashes and say, this is now your new leader. We're done and we're washing our hands of this. We're not getting involved and we're out of here. And I think really we're seeing a complete difference in those aims from Israel. So now Israel and the Gulf countries are, putting pressure on the US to pound Iran harder. And they're doing so because I don't think that the Israelis have ever really wanted regime change in Iran. I think that they want regime collapse. And I think that that's evident from the fact that they're bombing state apparatus, which is not military targets at all. So, like police stations, they're bombing border posts, and they're doing so, they're trying to foment internal chaos. And they're doing that in a way because they want to see the balkanization of Iran. So even all of the pressure that was being put on the Kurds to get involved in this and to create a civil war within Iran's territory, we even had Trump. And I think that Trump is very telling because he's such a sponge. He just says whatever the last person told him.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so he came out and he said, well, the map of Iran, I don't think is going to look the same. And I think that's the Israeli aim. And we know that the Israelis have already said, they've considered this war won already. They're planning to move to Turkey next. And many argue that after Turkey, it would be at India's behest, it would be Pakistan after that. But we know the domino, which is the next domino to fall, and that's going to be Turkey. And so I think that the divergent aims and whatever Netanyahu might have on Trump might keep them in this war to get Israel's aims fulfilled.
Yeah, what Netanyahu has on Trump, I think that's the million question there. Aisha, I just before I let you go, I wanted to ask about this. Do you think that there's been the U.S. hasn't been able to defend its allies in the Gulf region. Its focus has been on Israel, primarily defending Israel and its own assets, perhaps to some extent. That myth of U.S. invincibility and the U.S. umbrella, that's all gone away. Where do you think the Gulf countries are going to go after this? How do they defend themselves? Because clearly they don't have the ability themselves to, or militarily that they're not there, right? They're somewhere between incapable and incompetent when it comes to their military. So where really do you think they're going to go? People have been saying that Pakistan is going to become the next net security provider. We've got our own problems. I don't know if we can really take that role on, but just wanted your views on that.
Well, I think that the Gulf countries have proven that they can't make anything but a shopping mall at this stage. I think that Iran, given what it's being able to do, the war of attrition that it's being able to fight, given the fact that it's been left out in the cold and not being allowed to do anything for so many decades, it's just a testament to that, the invincibility of a people that doesn't want to surrender. And a lot has been made a theological debate about whether this comes from inherently from Shia faith or what else is this. I think that this is just what civilizations do when they're under threat. And I think if the Gulf now, indications are, from what I've been reading, are that they are doubling down on the US and Israel being their security providers. And particularly, I think that the UAE has thrown their lot in so much with Israel and now with India that I think that it will be looking more towards that partnership. But I think Saudi, you already saw Mohammed bin Salman, and then you saw the split between Saudi and UAE occur prior to this, after they saw Qatar being bombed, and they were like, wow, this regime is pretty crazy. The Israeli regime is pretty crazy, and we need to have our own bulwark to kind of resist this, to make that alliance with Pakistan. And we saw that Turkey might now also be a part of that too. And there is talk of creating a Muslim NATO. And I think if you're not going to create a Muslim NATO now, then when? And why not have, Iran be a part of that fold, given how much it's fought? And I was thinking this the other day, we've never really seen a state fight back the way that Iran has done. So you mentioned the first Gulf War. Going back to the first Gulf War, the Ba'athist armed forces they collapsed pretty quickly in 2003. Prior to that, you had the 1991 Gulf War, where again, they fell short of driving into Baghdad, but it was very, very easy for them to do that too. So beyond that time, we have seen the US lose again and again in Afghanistan and in Iraq in a way, but it's mainly been to non-state actors. It's been through the form of an insurgency. We haven't had the kind of state-to-state conflict that we are now seeing Iran wage. And I think that a lot of realists said that the Gulf states were being realistic. They were being pragmatic, right? Iran is the past. any kind of Muslim ummah or ideology is something very parochial. It's something of the past that they despised. And they threw their lot in. They, their pharaonic ambitions drew them to the US and Israel, being this is a technological future. These are the people that we have to be a part of if we want to be that rich Muslim country which has, ambitions in the world. And I think that that has been shot now. I think that that has been shot. And I think that if you're not going to go closer to the Muslim world, the global South, Russia and China, then I think that you're missing it. This is perhaps the end of the unipolar moment. I think we're seeing that now.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot that people are arguing that the US is showing its might, but to me this seems like the death pangs of an empire, really, right? That you elect the Donald Trumps and you fight these silly wars when you're in a position of weakness and when you lack that confidence of a global superpower, right? And I think that's really the moment that we're seeing here. Ayesha, thank you so much. It's been wonderful speaking to you, and I'm really grateful for both the legal and the political insight that you were able to give me. Thank you so much.